Who Am I? A short contemporary mystery crime story by the author Declan Conner. Part 1. Alderman drove along the country road toward his destination to interview a condemned man on death row. A first for him, the anticipation was palpable. The weather was dismal outside of Alderman's car, matching his mood as he dwelt on his wife walking out on him after her calling him a drunken loser. It had stabbed at his brain when she'd said that, then added that she didn't know who he was anymore. But then she had a point. That sentiment was mutual. Dark storm clouds polluted the atmosphere with the occasional thunder, followed by cracks of lightning growing ever nearer. His meeting with his editor of the local small-town weekly newspaper rolled around in his mind like tumbleweed as he drove on in a malaise of self-pity. Alderman hadn't realized he had a problem until first his wife and then his editor had spelled it out to him. His consumption of alcohol had caught up with him in ever-increasing increments. "Do something about it or I'll have to let you go," the editor had said. He sighed, longing for a whiskey, when he knew what he should be doing was concentrating on searching for a story to redeem himself and to get his life back on track. He reckoned the drudgery of working for a small-town newspaper and getting nowhere in life had caused him to take up drinking. A sigh of resignation escaped his lips. Rain pounded on the windshield, with the wipers struggling to maintain his view of the road ahead. To him, it was as though the Almighty had unloaded his wrath on him. Squinting as he drove on, Alderman's destination appeared ahead as the rain diminished to drizzle. The outer perimeter walls of the penitentiary loomed large as a bleak dark gray blot on the landscape. It should have been demolished years ago. But then, as the governor had said at his press conference after the riots there, he wasn't about to spend taxpayers' money on the dregs of society. Parked up, he made his way through the security procedures. The clomping of his shoes and the prison officer's boots walking at his side echoed along the corridors, to the occasional prisoner calling out in despair. The officer escorting him beckoned him to enter a room adjacent to the death row cells. An overpowering stench of damp in the room hit him as if he'd tumbled into a septic tank. Settled on a chair, Greg Alderman sat facing the condemned man, trying to get the measure of him to find out who he really was as a character and what made him a murderer. The prisoner leaned forward to the extent of his shackles.
"What brought you here? Who are you?"
The prisoner asked, as if Alderman being there was an inconvenience. The old man's hollow cheeks and his pallor of skin, denied of sunlight, displayed a menacing appearance. Alderman took out his recorder and pressed the start button. "The request to interview you should have told you who I am. You can call me Greg. I'm here as an investigative reporter to find out about you and what brought you here." The prisoner pushed back on his chair and folded his arms. He scoffed, laughed, then leaned forward, displaying an intimidating scowl.
"Who am I? You want to know who I am? The charge sheet said I'm Archie Reynolds, and that's the name on my cell door here on death row. But that's not who I am. I know this much. No one could deny it if they knew the truth as to who I am. I'm Ron Blakely, the man I'm supposed to have shot. All anyone really knows is that I'm a little over 5'7" tall and medium build with gray hair. I guess people could say I just look like any guy who lives next door, who keeps himself, well, to himself. What did I do? No doubt about that. I shot a man in cold blood."
There was a pause. Alderman thought he had it right about his appearance. He'd have ghosted past him in the street without giving him a second look. The prisoner stroked his chin as if deep in thought. The matter-of-factness to his admitting he'd shot a man in cold blood, it gave Alderman the shivers. The prisoner leaned forward again and continued.
"Okay, so I was drugged up, but they took no account of that during the trial. In fact, the sons of bitches didn't believe a word I said, apart from me pulling the trigger. Do I deserve to die? Hell, don't ask me. But the sucker I shot sure in hell's name deserves to be 6 foot under. He was the one drugging me."
Alderman shuffled on his chair and mansplained. He could see this was going to be hard work. "Do you think that you had a fair trial?"
Trial? That was some farce. I'm sick of remembering it like it was yesterday, every day, counting down to my appointment with the needle. The public defense attorney was a joke, a complete asshole. What have you got to say? the judge asked, after he pronounced me guilty. Fuck you, I said, and fuck the jury. None of you knows which way is up.
Yeah, I heard. I was there. Alderman looked him over. It appeared he wasn't going to get the truth, just the same dumbass details the prisoner had put forward in court, that the guy he had shot was Archie Reynolds. Part 2. Back in his office, it beggared his belief what Archie had told him. Of course, it was nothing new, he thought. Everyone on death row claimed to be innocent. But Archie's line of protest sure was different. Alderman had taken an interest in the trial from day one. He was convinced Archie would have had a better chance if he'd pleaded insanity. Alderman sat at his desk reading the transcript of the trial. "I'm not Archie," he'd said after they'd asked him to take the oath on the stand. "The stiff you dug up is Archie. My name is Ron Blakely." He pictured the prosecutor step up closer to Archie. "So, how do you account for the deceased dental records matching that of one Ron Blakely?" asked the prosecutor, while he recalled him holding up dental records. "You're the fucking smart one, you tell me," the accused replied. His public defense attorney hadn't wanted him to take the stand at all, and it was easy for anyone to see why as he read on. "Look, I ain't been to no dentist or a doctor in all my years, so how the hell would I know? Listen, I don't know how he did it, but the guy stole my identity, and he was going to steal my homestead and kill me. The son of a bitch drugged me and—" He recalled the prosecutor stopping Archie mid-sentence, holding up the palm of his hand, then made a statement, moving things along. "I put it to you that your story is a facade, and that you preyed on a poor old man who lived in isolation, and that you, in fact, shot him, acting with premeditation while high on drugs." "I shot him, all right. I thought he was going to kill me." The guy had fired back. In his mind's eye, Alderman conjured up images of that day he sat there in the public gallery as he read on. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "I shot him," said the prosecutor. He'd hesitated for dramatic effect, then turned to the accused. "By your own admission, then, you say you shot him. You claim self-defense, but there was no evidence of the deceased carrying a weapon of any kind." But that was all the prisoner managed to say when he was interrupted. "I have no more questions, Your Honor." He recalled the prosecutor walking back to his chair, a smug expression on his face as he took a seat. The defense attorney had remained seated. "No questions," he had said with a look of disinterest on his face as he shuffled his papers on the desk. The judge brought the gavel down. "We'll have a short recess of 15 minutes, after which I'll hear prosecution and defense's closing statements." He placed the transcript back on his desk, pushed back on his chair, and clasped his hand behind his head. As he pondered over the case, he thought that if Archie Reynolds was an alias, this would have been the first time in history that a man was to be executed by the state without knowing his real name. There were no birth records, no driver's license issued, no tax paid. In fact, there was nothing at all that could determine who the man actually was, other than what they had in witness statements, but they were hearsay, relayed to them by the victim. Alderman sighed. It would also be the first time in history a murderer would claim to be the victim he'd buried. When Alderman had requested an interview, he hadn't held out much hope. He'd been surprised when Archie had accepted it 2 years later, after all the appeals were exhausted. It seemed clear to him that Archie was guilty by his own admission. The only reason he had wanted a chance to talk to him was to see if he could unravel the mystery of who he really was. Alderman turned on the recording from his interview. "Okay, so if you say you're not Archie Reynolds and the jury reckoned you're not Ron Blakely, who the hell are you?"
"I know who I am, but who the hell are you? You look like a jerk, with a red nose and the stench of whiskey on your breath."
"Whatever. I'm just a reporter, one who hopes to get to the truth for the relatives of the victim. You owe them that?" Archie scoffed, then responded.
"Relatives? Don't know about no relatives of his. As for me, I was born and raised on the homestead off the grid. Ma and Pa didn't hold with authority. My parents died when I was in my 20s. Lived alone there ever since. Always gave the nearest town a wide berth. Ma always said I had a cousin lived in Vancouver, but I ain't never seen her. I guess she'll get the farm now if she's still alive, that is. I know Ma's sister died."
Alderman paused the recording. What he'd just heard, it made him even more certain he was making it all up, with no chance of checking out his story. He clicked the play button. "Do you know your cousin's name?"
Nah, she was my mother's sister's daughter.
"What was your mother's maiden name?"
Roberts. Mom said Aunt Lucy ran off to Canada when she got pregnant. Married some guy called Carter. Damned if I know his first name.
"So, your aunt would be Lucy Carter then. You ever married?"
Married?
He said, and then snickered.
No. Dated Beth Blake for over 20 years, until she died of leukemia at 42. Never looked at another woman since. Hey, don't tell her husband if he's still alive.
Archie had said as though as an afterthought and laughed like a lunatic. Alderman shuddered at the manic laugh as if it had mocked him, and then switched off the recording. The interview showed Archie had done his homework if what he had said was true of Blakely's background, while claiming to be him. He'd known all there was to know about Ron Blakely, what little of it there was, though it was probably all made up. Still, it wouldn't have surprised Alderman if some of it were true, when he thought of the 2 years Archie had spent helping out on the farm. The story, as he recalled it from the prisoner, was that Archie had been a drifter looking for work, and that he'd taken pity on him, not to mention he was slowing down in his old age and needed help. All Alderman knew of the victim was that the prisoner said the guy 6 foot under was the real Archie, and that he liked playing with anagrams, and he'd talked as if he'd traveled the world. Whoever it was that had been in front of him, he was clearly deluded. Not once could he find a way of tripping him up to get at the truth. He thought he had surely picked his victim well. They both had the same stature and a similar look. But with witnesses coming forward and identifying the dead man's death mask photograph, Archie's fate was sealed. Alderman had been granted one last visit to see Archie before his execution. He clung on to the hope that Archie would pull the curtain down on the truth as to who he was for his report. "What would be your last wish besides getting a last-minute stay of execution?" Alderman asked him. Archie rubbed at the stubble on his chin.
I wish your breath didn't smell of liquor.
He laughed, then sent Alderman a stern look.
Seriously, there's one thing I wish for you to do for me. Make sure they exchange the headstones on that scuzzball's grave with mine.
Alderman didn't know how he could respond to that, simply nodding his head.
Now go on and get the hell out of here and do some investigating.
It was some weeks later when Alderman returned to witness the execution. Archie entered the chamber for his appointment with death. Their eyes briefly locked through the glass screen. Archie gave him a thumbs up and grinned. There was no protest. He simply climbed onto the gurney with the officer's help, then they strapped him down. The executioner gave him the deadly concoction with a needle to his arm. Seconds later, his body writhed for what seemed like an eternity of agony. The tremors subsided. Archie's death when it came was swift after a final rising of the chest and a gasp as he expelled his last breath. There seemed to be more tension in the minds of witnesses than that coming from Archie, judging by their contorted faces. No last-minute confession as to who he actually was. Alderman felt let down. There was a story there, but it was and would remain a mystery. Was the guy insane? He wondered. He determined that anyone who could keep up the lie the way Archie had must be a few cents short of $1. Leastways, that was the angle he would use to call for an end to capital punishment in his state. Part 3. It was a week later when Alderman pulled off the freeway and he drove on for the 4 miles along a dirt road with a rutted track to Ron Blakely's homestead. After 2 years abandoned, the place had fallen into disrepair. The realtor's sign seemed like a joke. Not like someone would drive past and buy this place, he mused. It was clear why Archie had said the place was hard to get to during the winter months. He wandered around and took some photographs for the article. It wasn't until he saw the farm that it began to bug him as to why Archie would just drop on his victim for no reason with a shot to the chest. He must have had a motive to make Blakely a target, he conjectured. Maybe he wasn't a target of identity theft as he claimed. That was all in Archie's imagination, he thought. He looked down into the hole the police had dug to retrieve Blakely's body, wishing it could tell him the story of what happened that day. All that came to mind was that Archie had simply shot him in a drug-induced fog, and that there was no real motive. He sat on a wooden fence rail and checked through the photographs he'd taken. Steinbeck Realtors, it said on the sign. His thoughts turned to who would benefit from the sale. Archie had talked about a cousin, but there again, he wondered if he'd conjured her up from his fertile mind. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, but with no signal, he headed back to his office. Part 4. Taking a seat at his desk, Alderman picked up the phone from the cradle and made a call.
Steinbeck's?
A woman said when she answered the call. Hi, Greg Alderman here from the Weekly News. Blakely's homestead, who's the seller?
Stern and Springsteen attorneys, court appointed.
Alderman closed the call and then phoned the attorney's number. They'd located Blakely's cousin, who now lived in England, but that's as much as they would give away. On a hope and a prayer, he gave them his telephone number and asked if they'd pass it on. His boss had arranged for him to look over the homicide file, and he set off for the district attorney's office. They ushered him into a small room without air conditioning and produced a pile of boxes. Regardless of the discomfort, he plowed through the papers and made notes. He called out to the assistant DA who was skulking around in the room. Where were these found? Alderman imagined he was there to make sure he didn't take away any of the evidence file.
Those papers were taken from under Archie's mattress.
There were endless attempts to copy Ron Blakely's signature. The driver's license photograph clearly showed it was a picture of the deceased. There was a copy of the man's signature on a form from a bank account opened 12 months prior. A pattern struck him that all the proofs of identity were obtained during the last 2 years leading up to Blakely's death. Even the birth certificate was a copy issued only 20 months prior. The forensics report showed a partial fingerprint of Archie's on the paper, with attempts at forging the signature, but nothing from the deceased. Archie's explanation had been that the deceased had placed them there. He continued to scour witness statements. Most of the local traders had neither seen nor heard of Blakely until the last 2 years or so. The guy from a local bar said he'd taken to coming there weekly for a drink, and he'd made a point of getting to know the locals. Why would someone suddenly become sociable after all those years of hiding away, ran around in his mind and stuck there a while? Archie's own statements were consistent throughout, with claims that the deceased had drugged him and was going to kill him. Alderman still believed the evidence was there for Archie to be guilty, besides his own admission of guilt, but the timeline of the evidence seemed too neat regards identity and motive, but not past coincidence. He took the DNA results of both Archie and Ron and had the clerk make copies.
There's nothing for you to find on this one. Cut and dried. What are the copies for?
Posterity. Gonna hang them on my wall to show how clever you are at having the guy put to sleep. Beats me why you went for the death penalty. The guy was obviously a crazy. The assistant DA shrugged his shoulders.
His defense attorney didn't think so, or he'd have used it in his not guilty plea, instead of him using standing his ground in self-defense.
He sent a smirk in Alderman's direction. Hope you can sleep at night?
Don't worry about me. I sleep sound as a daisy.
The assistant DA stabbed him a sarcastic smile. Don't you have doubts that the evidence is too neat? It wasn't his fingerprints on the spade that dug the grave.
So, he had the guy dig his own grave. Listen, stop wasting my time. Besides, the guy filled in his own grave when he admitted he pulled the trigger.
Alderman knew that if a hiker wouldn't have come across Archie dragging the body into the grave, there'd have been no trial. The assistant DA was right. It was a cut-and-dried case, a slam dunk. Whatever, it still left him wondering if Archie Reynolds was his real name. Part 5. Safely entrenched in his office amongst friendly faces, he started to type out his report when his extension rang.
Hi, Amanda Dyson here. I understand you want to speak with me?
The name didn't sound familiar, but the English twang in her Canadian accent gave her away. I'm guessing you're Ron Blakely's cousin.
So I'm led to believe.
There wasn't much she could say except that she was aware she had an American cousin who lived on an off-the-grid homestead. She'd known he was called Ron, but never met him. Her mother had tried writing to him, but he never replied. At one time, her mother had spoken with an old friend who told her he lived like a recluse, and no one ever saw him.
My ex-husband always said we should look him up. But then Charlie would.
Why is that?
He could smell money a mile away, always going on about a possible inheritance. Charlie needn't have made a fuss about it if we still lived together, especially now the homestead is to be signed over to me.
Did you and Charlie ever try to contact him?
No, but then I threw Charlie out. He disappeared. Last I heard, he'd moved back to Canada.
Amanda gave him her telephone number, and he thanked her before finishing the call. Not much to add to the story, he thought. Alderman finished his article to date and then sent it off to the proofreader before moving on to his next assignment. Part 6. The day after, the switchboard secretary put a call through to Alderman.
Hi, Amanda Dyson here. Remember me?
Sure do. What can I do for you?
I know it's a lot to ask, but I've decided to visit the farm. I was wondering if you could point me in the right direction when I arrive.
No sign of a sale, then?
We've had a few lowball offers, but the realtor says I could do a lot better if I'd fix the place up. So I thought, why not take a look? Besides, there are papers to sign for the money when his estate is to be released, and they'll need my ID handed over in person.
No problem. When do you arrive?
Saturday afternoon, if that's not too much trouble. I can take a taxi into town from the airport.
Sure. I'll give you my cell phone number and you can call me when you arrive. Part 7. Amanda was a diminutive figure when Alderman set eyes on her. No more than 5'2" tall, with long, flowing auburn hair. In her early 50s, she had a figure to die for at her age. Amanda had an ever-present smile and a way about her that would command anyone's attention. The problem was, it was hard to get a word in edgewise as she talked incessantly on the way to the farm. The talking soon stopped when the farmhouse came into view. They climbed out of the car, and he followed in her wake as she marched over there to the farmhouse. She stood there akimbo and shook her head.
Oh my. Going to need more than a lick of paint.
He escorted her on a tour of the inside.
Might be cheaper to knock it down and rebuild. It's a nice property, though. Really picturesque surroundings. If there's enough money in the estate, I could do it up and live here. More space here than back home in my apartment in Liverpool.
Alderman thought she'd be nuts to live in such isolation, but he kept his counsel. You can't sleep here tonight, he said. None of the off-grid services are working. There's a motel in town.
Sounds good. No point in hanging around,
she said as they headed off. If you don't mind me saying, don't you think you'd be better off selling it as it is? From what I hear, your cousin had only used it for his own needs. The livestock went years ago. It would be a hell of a task to build it up as a farm business. She sighed.
Maybe you're right. If Charlie hadn't been such a shit, he'd be in his element here.
Why is that? He asked, as his reporter's nose kicked in.
Said he was brought up on a farm and it was his dream to own one.
She let out a long, drawn-out sigh.
Serves the secretive control freak right.
Control freak?
Yeah, he hated me talking to neighbors. Said he liked to keep things private. I didn't know what he was up to until it was too late.
That piqued Alderman's interest. He couldn't help his reporter's nose smelling a story at her saying that. What did you mean by that? She turned to face him, a solemn expression appearing on her face.
I never knew what he did for a living. Kept his office locked at home.
And, he said, prompting her to reveal more.
There was always tons of mail being delivered. He'd wait for it to arrive and disappear into his office. I used to hear the shredder going, and then he'd go into the backyard and empty the shreds into a barrel and incinerate them.
His furtive mind worked overtime on scenarios for Charlie's actions. Secret Service. Could that be it? Alderman smelled a story.
I wish,
she said and laughed.
Fishing. That's with a PH. Well, that's what the police said when they broke the door down and took away his computer. Caught him at the airport trying to escape the country.
Fishing? Isn't that where you use fraud to gain information about people to steal their money?
I'd never heard of it at the time. But I suppose that about sums it up. Pity they only locked him up for 6 months. Said something about a first offense or he'd have got more time. Never saw him again. Only managed to divorce him 6 months ago for desertion.
Alderman stroked his chin. He thought it worth asking for more detail as a hunch developed. Was Charlie Dyson his full name?
No, Charles Richard Edward Dyson. It said on my wedding certificate. Charles R. E. Dyson on the family bills.
Alderman started to get excited, took out his cell, and made a note of the name. Do you mind if we stop by my office? I have a photo of your cousin to look at.
Not at all. It would be nice to know what he looked like.
He put his foot down once they reached the freeway and sped toward town. It was only a hunch, but he reckoned there was a slim chance of Archie being Charlie. If it was, he knew the story would be syndicated in all the nationals. He phoned ahead on his cell phone. Get me photos printed off for Archie Reynolds and Ron Blakely and send them down to the lobby. His car screeched to a halt outside his office, and he sprinted to the lobby where his secretary was waiting. All she handed him was the mugshot of Archie, seeing as how the system had gone down. He was breathless when he returned to his car and jumped in. He thrust the picture toward Amanda. Here, do you recognize this guy? Amanda studied the picture with a puzzled look on her face.
Am I supposed to know him? Is this my cousin?
Alderman felt deflated. No, the system is down. I'll get you a copy later.
Who is this?
Amanda said with a quizzical look on her face, then handed it back. Alderman's demeanor hit south that she hadn't recognized him. I wish I knew. It's the guy who killed your cousin.
Why show me?
I've got to be honest and say I thought it could be Charlie.
Hell no,
She said and laughed.
Now where's that motel? The jet lag is getting to me.
Part 8. Alderman sat at his workstation, his feet on the desk, while he rocked on his chair. Out of boredom, he'd gone through half a ream of paper, crunching each one into a ball and tossing them into a now overflowing wastebasket. He almost tipped his chair over as his extension rang. Yeah, who is it? The editor answered. He wanted him in his office. He stepped over there while hoping it wasn't going to be another dressing down about his drinking. He dropped a mint into his mouth, then entered.
Look, we need to hold off on your report on the Archie Reynolds affair.
That wasn't what he was expecting to hear. Why?
I've had the governor on the phone. Someone has tipped him off about your article. You know it's an election year?
So what? The editor rose to his feet, placed his palms face down on the desk and leaned forward.
Because he supports the death penalty, that's what. More than half our readers are of the same political persuasion. What's that gonna do for circulation if we're seen to go against him? Besides, the guy went through every appeal, and he was proved guilty as hell. All you've got is an opinion as to his sanity, and you ain't no shrink.
Alderman resented that all his work had been for nothing, and it would be back to reporting on petty crime. He scowled at the editor. So, the decision's made?
Yup, the buck stops here.
He took his seat again. Fuck you, Alderman said and stormed out. He collected his coat and headed for Luke's bar. Alderman ignored his co-workers and sat alone in a corner, drinking whiskey. He took out his notebook and wrote the name, Charlie Richard Edward Dyson, while not happy that Amanda didn't recognize him from the photo. Underneath, he wrote the name, Archie Reynolds. 5 whiskeys later, he'd recalled all his interviews with Archie. Archie had said the victim liked anagrams. Why didn't I ask Amanda about that, he thought. He discounted the notion. Damn, she'd have recognized his picture, he said aloud, to a guy at the next table, snatching a look at him. He sent him a mind-your-own-business glance back at the guy. Out of curiosity, he crossed off the letters spelling Archie Reynolds' name from Charlie's name. He was left with an R and an E once he scribbled out the remaining lowercase letters. Jesus, Charlie E. R. Dyson, he called out as he stumbled out of the bar and headed back to the office. Amanda lied to me. Maybe she's in on it, he mumbled to himself. He hurried back to the office. It was in darkness, and he let himself in with his key. Sat at his desk, Alderman dialed a number of a reporter contact in the UK. Jim, how's it going over there in England?
Have you seen the time? It's 4 a.m. here.
Alderman stopped him mid-flow. Listen, sorry about this, but can you get a hold of criminal records in the UK? More specifically, DNA records. If not, a rap sheet with a photo will do.
Hell, they're tighter than a barren hen's arse over here when it comes to getting computer records. It'll cost you.
You owe me, remember?
Damn, so I do. Okay, give me the name. But just so you know, that's you and me all square.
He passed him what information he had, together with his email address, and hoped for the best. With the system back online, he printed a copy of the photograph of Ron Blakely taken by the medical examiner. He opened a drawer and took out a bottle of whiskey and a glass. Doubt crept into his thoughts as he stared at his notebook with the anagram. The 26 letters of Charlie's full name seemed to leap off the page. Damn, I'm just trying to make it fit, he surmised. He opened up his browser and searched for an anagram site, located one, then typed in Dyson's name. It worked out another 6 names. Eyes heavy and with his fill of whiskey, he placed his arms on his desk and rested his head on them, then drifted to sleep. There was a stabbing pain on his shoulder, and Alderman lifted his head from his desk. His eyes squinted at the stabbing rays of the sun penetrating through the window.
"Mr. Alderman, are you okay?"
said the janitor.
"I think you'll need to be freshening up. The office will be open in 15 minutes.
The janitor handed him a mint and then put the half-empty whiskey bottle and glass back in the drawer for him. "Yeah, thanks," he said, and made for the bathroom. Arriving back at his desk, there it was on the screen. The message he'd been waiting for had arrived. He printed it off and opened the drawer to his desk. Alderman fumbled in his bottom drawer and pulled out the Blakely file. He sat back after he compared the results from the email. Part 9. Alderman waited impatiently at the motel as the receptionist called Amanda on the phone and asked her to come to reception.
I could have slept for another week. Thanks for getting me up, but what's so urgent?
She asked as she walked into reception. Just take a look at this. He passed her the photograph of Ron Blakely and watched her for a response. She seemed unsteady on her feet. Here, sit down.
Why is he asleep?
Why is who asleep?
Charlie. Who else? That's my ex-husband. Don't tell me you didn't know who it was? Who did you think it was?
Hell, I didn't have a clue until I read the DNA results and saw a copy of his mugshot. But now you've confirmed it for certain. I know one smug scuzzball at the DA's office that ain't gonna be sleeping. One thing's for sure, the assistant DA is going to have to swap some headstones around. Alderman walked into his office and gathered his things together from his desk into a box. He took out the bottle of whiskey, stepped over to a sink, and emptied the contents down the drain hole. Returned to his station, he picked up the box. His editor walked by, stopped, and gave him a questioning look, standing there with his hands on his hips.
What are you doing?
I quit. That's what I'm doing. You and that governor of yours can go and disappear up your own backsides. I'm heading out of here to offer my story to the Nationals. You'll be able to read it and weep. The editor stood there with a pained expression and scratched at his bald head. Alderman had a grin a mile wide as he opened the door, then whistled a tune to the refrain of Yankee Doodle as he stepped briskly out of the office, considering his life had just turned a corner. He now knew who he was, never mind him now knowing the identity of Ron Blakely, who the DA had put to death. Dear listener, if you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like it and to subscribe for more stories to come. Declan Conner is the author of a catalog of full-length psychological mystery crime and speculative thriller fiction books available on Amazon in all territories. You'll find the link in the description.